The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood why. Red light flooded the sensor bay, and every officer around me stopped breathing for a moment. My name is Vex Doran, and I have served on Dominion patrol ships for 11 cycles. I have seen pirate skirmishes. I have seen rebel ships try to run our blockades. I have never seen my own equipment refuse to give me a straight answer. "Report," snapped Captain Rurik Thane from the command chair behind me. His voice was calm, the way it always was, because nothing ever really happened out here. Our cruiser, the Ashvane Talon, was assigned to the quiet edge of Dominion space, a stretch of stars nobody important cared about. We called it the Forgotten Border. Ships like ours came here to finish their careers peacefully, not to find anything worth this much fear. "Single contact, sir," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were not. "Unknown design, drifting at low power near the outer marker." "Terran vessel?" he asked, already sounding bored. The humans were a young species, barely out of their own solar system by Dominion standards. We had crossed paths with them a few times, mostly diplomatic, sometimes tense, never violent enough to matter. Nobody on this bridge expected trouble from them. "The hull signature does not match anything in the Terran registry," I said. "It does not match anything in our registry either." That got his attention. He walked over, boots clicking against the metal floor, and looked over my shoulder at the display. The shape on the screen was long, dark, and strangely simple. No decorative plating. No obvious weapon turrets sticking out like most warships we had studied. Just smooth lines, like something built by someone who did not care how it looked, only how it worked. "Could be a derelict," said Priam Ostek, our tactical officer, from 2 seats down. He was young, eager, and always trying to sound confident in front of the captain. Something drifted out of a scrapyard. Maybe Terran freight haulers lost a cargo module. I wanted to agree with him. It would have been easier, but the numbers on my screen kept refusing to make sense. "It is not drifting," I said. "The engines are idling. Low output, but active. Something is keeping that hull warm." Rurik crossed his arms. "Then it is a scout ship. Probably damaged, probably lost. Hail it. Standard border protocol. If it does not respond, we board it." I sent the hailing signal myself, using the frequency bands most young species used for open communication. Silence answered us. Not static, not garbled noise, just silence, as if the ship on the other end was listening but simply did not feel the need to speak yet. "Increase resolution on the hull," Rurik ordered. I adjusted the scanners, and the image sharpened. That was when the first real chill crossed the bridge. The ship was massive. Not massive in the way Dominion capital ships were massive, built wide and heavy to intimidate. This one was long and narrow, built the way a blade is built, made only to cut through space efficiently, nothing wasted. "Mass reading is wrong," said my scanner partner, a quiet woman named Alira Voss. She tapped her console twice, checking for an error. "It says this ship weighs as much as one of our capital cruisers, but it is barely half the size." "Recalibrate," Rurik said. She did. The number did not change. I felt something cold settle in my chest, the kind of feeling you get when your instincts understand a threat before your mind has finished the math. I looked at the shape again, the smooth, unmarked hull, and I thought about how a species we considered primitive could possibly build something so dense, so quiet, so patient. "Sir," I said, "before we send a boarding team, I would like to run a passive energy scan, just to understand what we are dealing with." Rurik studied me for a moment, then nodded once. Quickly. I ran the scan, and the results came back slower than usual, as if the ship itself was resisting an easy read. When the data finally settled, I stared at it in disbelief. Weapon systems, fully charged, distributed across the hull in patterns I did not recognize. Shield capacitors holding more stored energy than our entire cruiser could generate in a full cycle. And beneath it all, a power core reading so deep and so steady that my instruments assumed at first it was a sensor malfunction. "This is not a scout ship," I said quietly. "This is not damaged. This is not lost." "Then what is it?" Rurik asked, his patience thinning. "I do not know," I admitted, "but it is awake, and it is armed, and it has been sitting here long enough to notice us before we noticed it." The bridge went quiet. Even Priam, who always had something clever to say, said nothing. Rurik straightened his shoulders, the way he always did when he wanted to look certain in front of his crew. "It is a single ship," he said. "We are a Dominion cruiser with 2 escort frigates. Whatever it is, whoever built it, one ship does not frighten the Dominion fleet." I wanted to believe him. I really did, but my scans kept updating, and every new detail made my stomach tighten further. I noticed something else then, something that made even less sense than the raw power readings. "Captain," I said, "the Terran registry code is still active on this vessel, buried under encryption, but it is there. This is a human ship." The room seemed to shrink around those words. Rurik turned to look at the screen again, his earlier confidence flickering, just slightly, like a candle catching a breath of wind. "A human ship," he repeated slowly, as if saying it again would make it sound less impossible. "Yes, sir." "That cannot be right," Priam said, leaning forward, staring at his own display. "Humans do not build ships like this. They barely have colonies past their own system. Their war fleets are small. Their weapons are years behind ours. Everyone knows this." "I know what everyone knows," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "I am telling you what my scanners are showing me." Rurik walked back to his chair slowly, sitting down with the kind of stiffness that comes from forcing calm onto a nervous body. "Options," he said, quickly. "We could retreat and report it," Alira offered. "Let a research vessel study it from a distance." "We could try communication again," I said. "A more formal signal, official Dominion protocol, see if it responds to structured contact." "Or we assert dominance," Priam said, his voice tightening with forced confidence. "Fire a warning shot. Remind it who commands this region of space." I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to real worry about a decision made on this bridge. "It is not moving," I said. "It is not hiding. It is not calling for help. Whatever this is, it does not act like something that is afraid of us." "Everything is afraid of the Dominion fleet," Rurik said, but his voice lacked its usual weight. Silence stretched across the bridge as the captain considered his options. I watched the shape of the ship on my screen, still and quiet, waiting the way a predator waits when it already knows it does not need to move first. I had spent 11 cycles studying threats across dozens of systems, and I had never once felt this particular kind of unease, the sense that we were the ones being measured, not the other way around. "Send the formal hail," Rurik finally said. "Full diplomatic protocol. If there is no response within 2 minutes, we fire a single warning shot across its bow. That is the correct procedure for an unidentified vessel refusing contact." I nodded and began composing the message, my fingers steady, even though my mind was racing. As I worked, Alira leaned toward me and whispered just quiet enough for only me to hear. "Vex, does this feel wrong to you, or is it just me?" I did not answer right away. I finished typing the message, sent it out into the dark, toward that long, patient shape drifting on our sensors, and only then did I let myself say what I truly believed. "It feels like we walked into a room we were not invited into," I said. "And whoever is inside has been watching the door long before we knocked." The message went out. 2 minutes began to count down on my screen, each second stretching longer than it should have. Nobody on the bridge spoke. Nobody moved. Even Priam, who always found something to fill silence with, sat frozen, staring at the ship that refused to answer. I do not know what I expected to happen when those 2 minutes ended. Some part of me hoped for a response, a voice, anything that would prove this was simple misunderstanding, a lost vessel, a confused crew. But as the countdown reached 0 and silence remained the only answer, I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that whatever was sitting out there in the dark had already decided how this conversation was going to go. and it was not going to be decided by us. The countdown reached 0, and Rurik gave the order without hesitation. Fire the warning shot. Standard energy pulse, low yield, across its bow. Priam's hands moved across his console, and a bright streak of light shot out from our forward cannon, cutting through the dark toward that long, silent shape. I watched the impact marker on my screen, expecting the usual result, a flash of energy dispersing harmlessly ahead of a target as a symbol of our strength, a message meant to say we could have hit you, but chose not to. The shot struck the human ship directly. I froze, staring at the readout, certain I had made an error in the targeting calculations. But Priam's panel confirmed the same thing. The pulse had not missed. It had not been meant to miss. Somehow, in the space of a single moment, the shot had connected exactly where our weapon aimed, and the impact should have scorched at least a section of that hull. Instead, the energy readings showed something absorbing the blast almost entirely. A faint shimmer rippled across the ship's surface, there and gone in a heartbeat, like water settling after a stone breaks its surface. "Report," Rurik said, his voice tighter now. "Shields," Alira said, disbelief clear in her tone. "Sir, it has shields. Strong ones. The pulse barely registered as damage." "That is not possible," Priam said. "Terran shield technology is generations behind ours. Their ships cannot generate output like that." "I am reading the data in front of me," Alira snapped back, unusual frustration breaking through her normally calm demeanor. "I do not care what the registry says humans are capable of. This ship absorbed a direct hit, like it was nothing." I stared at the screen, watching the human vessel sit exactly where it had been before, untouched, unmoved, as if our attack had simply been an inconvenience rather than an act of aggression. And then something happened that made the entire bridge go still. The ship fired back. There was no buildup, no warning charge visible on our sensors, just a single beam of concentrated energy that crossed the distance between us, faster than any weapon system I had personally witnessed. It struck one of our escort frigates, the Solon Ward, directly along its side. The frigate did not explode. It did not break apart in the dramatic way ships do when destroyed by weapons fire. Instead, an entire section of its hull simply went dark, power draining instantly, as if some invisible hand had reached across space and pulled the plug on half its systems. "Solon Ward is reporting total power failure across 3 decks, came the voice of our communications officer, panic edging into her words. "Life support is failing. They are requesting immediate evacuation assistance." Rurik stood from his chair, gripping the edge of his console. "One shot," he said, almost to himself. One shot crippled an entire frigate. I checked my scanners again, desperate to understand what I had just witnessed. The weapon signature did not match anything cataloged in our threat database. It was not a standard energy weapon, not a projectile, not anything I recognized from any species we had studied. It behaved almost like it had been designed specifically to disable rather than destroy, precise in a way that felt unsettlingly deliberate. "They are not trying to kill us," I said slowly, the realization forming as I spoke it aloud. If they wanted the Solon Ward gone, it would be gone. That shot was controlled. Restrained. Restrained is not a word I associate with an attack that just crippled one of my ships, Rurik said, his composure finally starting to crack at the edges. A new signal appeared on our communication display, cutting through the tension on the bridge like a blade. It was the human ship, finally responding, but not with the fear or confusion we expected. The voice that came through was calm, almost bored, speaking our own trade language with a strange, careful evenness. "This is Captain Grace Bennett, of the survey vessel Meridian," the voice said. "You fired first. That was a mistake. I am giving you one chance to withdraw before this becomes something neither of us wants." The bridge fell into stunned silence. A single voice, calm and unafraid, speaking to an entire Dominion cruiser and its escort as if we were the ones who needed to be careful. "Identify your authority," Rurik said, forcing steadiness into his tone as he responded. "You are operating an unregistered vessel in Dominion territory. showing weapon capabilities inconsistent with your species classification. Explain yourself." There was a pause before the response came, and when it did, the voice carried something almost like patience, the kind reserved for someone trying to explain a simple concept to someone who refuses to understand it. "My authority is that my ship is still fully operational, and yours is currently missing one working frigate," Captain Bennett said. "I am not here to start a conflict with the Dominion. I was passing through, conducting survey work, minding my own business, until your cruiser decided to open fire on me without provocation. I would prefer this end here." Priam turned to the captain, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier bravado. "Sir, should we stand down?" Rurik's jaw tightened. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weight of Dominion pride pressing against the very real damage sitting beside us, in the shape of a crippled frigate. Pride won. "We do not stand down to a single unregistered vessel," he said, loud enough for the whole bridge to hear. "Prepare full weapons array. Target its main hull sections. Fire on my mark." I felt a knot form in my chest, the same instinct that had warned me earlier now screaming louder. "Captain, with respect," our first shot barely scratched its shields, and its return fire crippled an entire frigate in one strike. "A full volley may provoke a response we cannot survive." "Your objection is noted," Rurik said, not looking at me. "Prepare to fire." A lyra caught my eye from across the bridge, and I saw the same fear reflected there that was building in my own chest. Neither of us said anything more. Orders were orders, even when every instinct screamed that those orders were wrong. The weapons officer counted down the charge sequence, and I watched the human ship on my screen, still sitting motionless, still refusing to retreat, as if it were simply waiting to see what foolish choice we would make next. Something about that stillness terrified me more than any aggressive maneuver could have. It was the stillness of something that had already calculated every possible outcome and found none of them threatening. "Full weapons charged," Priam announced. "Awaiting your order, Captain." Rurik looked at the screen one final time, at that long, dark shape refusing to move, refusing to fear us the way every other species we had encountered eventually learned to fear the Dominion banner. "Fire," he said. Every cannon on our cruiser released at once, along with everything our remaining frigate could contribute. A storm of energy crossed the black distance toward the human ship, enough firepower to have vaporized most vessels in our own registry several times over. For a moment, the entire view screen turned white with the light of our own assault, and I found myself holding my breath, some small foolish part of me hoping this would be enough, that whatever strange advantage that ship possessed would finally break under the weight of our full arsenal. When the light faded, the human ship was still there. Scorched in places, yes. Sections of its outer plating had clearly taken damage, streaks of dark residue marking where our weapons had connected. But it had not broken apart, it had not lost power, it sat in the same position it had occupied since we first detected it, as steady and unmoving as before, as if our entire assault had been little more than an uncomfortable itch. "Status," Rurik demanded, his voice losing the last of its earlier confidence. "Shields at 60%, came the reply from the frigate captain over the comm, though I quickly realized the number referred to the human ship, not our own. Somehow our own scanners had automatically begun tracking the enemy's condition rather than our own, an instinctive shift born from pure disbelief that anything could withstand what we had just thrown at it. 60%, Priam repeated numbly. "We just fired everything we had, and it is still above half shields." The comm crackled again, and Captain Bennett's voice returned, still calm, but now carrying something colder beneath the surface, something that made my skin prickle with a fear I had never felt from an enemy before. "I gave you a chance," she said. "You wasted it. I want to be very clear about something. This ship you are firing at is not our most capable design. It is not even close. If you continue this engagement, I will stop being careful about how much of your fleet remains functional afterward." Rurik's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles paled. "She is bluffing," he muttered, though the words sounded less like a statement and more like something he desperately needed to be true. I looked at the screen, at the ship still sitting there, patient and untouched by everything we had thrown at it, and I understood with a terrible clarity that Captain Bennett was not bluffing at all. She was simply telling us the truth, the way you might warn a child away from a fire before they burn themselves badly enough to learn a lesson the hard way. The question now was whether Rurik would listen, or whether pride would push us straight into finding out exactly how much worse this could become. Rurik stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the human ship on the screen, as if trying to will it into behaving the way our training had promised every enemy would behave. I watched him closely, hoping he would find the sense to stand down, but I already knew the answer before he spoke. "Reload all cannons," he ordered. "Target its primary power core this time. If shields absorbed our previous strike, we concentrate fire on a single point until they fail." "Sir," I said, unable to keep silent any longer. Her warning was clear. She told us she has not been fighting at full capability. I do not think continuing this is wise. "Officer Doran," Rurik said sharply, "your job is sensor analysis, not fleet strategy. Return to your station." I clenched my jaw and turned back to my console, though every part of me wanted to argue further. Alira gave me a small, sympathetic glance, but neither of us could do anything except watch the disaster unfold. The cannons charged again, this time slower, more deliberate, concentrating their combined output toward a single calculated point on the human ship's hull. I monitored the targeting solution nervously, watching numbers climb as our weapons prepared to unleash everything they had into one focused strike. Before our cannons could fire, something changed on the human vessel. The faint shimmer that had marked its shields during our first attack brightened suddenly, spreading across its entire hull in a pattern that looked almost alive, shifting and adjusting in real time. I stared at my screen, watching the energy signature evolve mid-scan, as if the ship itself was learning from the exact frequency of our previous assault and adapting instantly to counter it. "Its shields are recalibrating," I said, my voice rising with alarm. It adjusted the frequency to match our weapon output almost the moment we locked target. "That is impossible," Priam said, though his voice had lost all conviction behind the word. "No shield system reacts that fast." "Clearly this one does," I snapped back, frustration bleeding through despite myself. Rurik ignored the exchange, his focus locked entirely on the tactical display. "Fire," he ordered. Every cannon released at once, the full weight of our combined arsenal screaming across the void toward that single point on the human hull. I held my breath, watching the impact unfold on my screen, praying for even a fraction of the damage we needed to see. The shields held. Not perfectly. A visible crack of energy rippled across the hull where our combined fire struck, and for one brief moment I thought we had finally found a weakness. But the shimmer stabilized almost instantly, the damage contained, the ship still steady in space exactly as before. "Shields at 40%, came the report, and this time nobody bothered pretending confidence. 40% remaining after everything we had thrown at it, after 2 full volleys from an entire cruiser and its escort frigate. My mind struggled to process numbers that should not have been possible for a species we had spent years dismissing as unworthy of serious concern. The human ship did not fire back immediately. For several long seconds it simply sat there, and I found myself almost more afraid of that silence than I had been of its earlier retaliation. Then Captain Bennett's voice returned over the comm, and this time the calm patience from before had disappeared entirely, replaced by something colder, something final. "You had 2 chances," she said. "You are not getting a third." The human ship moved. It was the first time since we detected it that the vessel had actually changed position, and the way it moved defied everything I understood about propulsion systems. There was no visible engine flare, no gradual acceleration curve I could track on my sensors. One moment it sat motionless in the black, and the next it had simply relocated closer to our formation, as if the space between us had folded rather than been traveled. "Impossible," Alira whispered beside me, her fingers frozen over her console. Before any of us could react, Weapons fire erupted from the human ship, but this time it was not a single controlled strike aimed at disabling power. Multiple beams lanced out simultaneously, striking precise points across our remaining frigate's hull, the Corvin blade, in what looked almost like a demonstration rather than an attack. Each beam found a different critical system. Engines, weapons array, communication relay, each one going dark in an instant without a single explosion, without a single visible sign of destruction beyond sudden and total failure. Corvin blade is completely disabled, came the frantic report over comms. All primary systems offline. We are drifting. I stared at the readouts in horror, understanding now exactly what Captain Bennett had meant by her earlier warning. This had not been an attempt to destroy our ships. It had been a demonstration of exactly how easily she could, if she chose to, and exactly how much restraint she had shown until now. 2 ships neutralized without a single hull breach, I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else on the bridge. She is not trying to kill us. She is trying to make sure we understand we cannot win. Rurik's face had gone pale, the confident authority he carried since I first served under his command completely drained away. He looked at the tactical display, at our own cruiser now standing alone against a ship that had disabled 2 vessels without expending what appeared to be significant effort. All remaining weapons, he said, his voice cracking slightly, target its hull directly. Full output. Captain, I said, stepping forward despite regulation, despite the risk to my own position, please reconsider. She has shown restraint twice already. If we continue, we may not receive a third warning. For a moment, something flickered across his expression, doubt perhaps, or fear finally breaking through years of Dominion pride. But then his shoulders squared again, and I recognized the look of a man who would rather risk everything than admit defeat in front of his crew. Fire, he said. Our remaining cannons unleashed everything they had left, the last full assault our cruiser could manage. I watched the beams cross space toward the human ship, and for the briefest moment, I allowed myself to hope. The shields absorbed the strike entirely this time, not even a visible ripple marking the impact. Whatever adaptation process had been happening within that vessel's systems had apparently completed, leaving our weapons essentially useless against whatever configuration it had settled into. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, as everyone on the bridge waited to see what would happen next. I watched the human ship on my screen, steady, patient, utterly unbothered by everything we had thrown at it across 2 increasingly desperate assaults. Then Captain Bennett's voice returned one final time, and there was something in her tone now that chilled me far more than any weapon could have. It was not anger, it was not triumph, it was simple, quiet disappointment, the kind reserved for watching someone make a mistake you had already warned them about twice. I told you this ship was not our most capable design, she said. I want you to understand something clearly before this goes any further. What you are looking at right now is a survey vessel. It was built to map star systems and study stellar phenomena, not to fight wars. And it has already disabled 2 of your ships without taking a single point of what your species would consider serious damage. The bridge remained utterly silent, every officer staring at their screens, at the ship, at each other, unable to process the weight of what she had just said. If a survey vessel can do this, she continued, I would strongly encourage you to consider what our actual warships are capable of. I am giving you one final chance to withdraw. After this, I will stop giving warnings entirely. Rurik stood frozen at his chair, staring at the screen, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine fear settle into his expression. The Dominion had spent generations believing itself untouchable, believing that its fleets represented the pinnacle of galactic strength. Watching a single ship, built for peaceful exploration rather than war, dismantle our attack without breaking a sweat, shattered something fundamental in the way every officer on that bridge understood our place in the galaxy. I looked at the tactical display one final time, at the human ship still sitting patiently in the dark, waiting to see what choice we would make, and I understood with absolute certainty that whatever answer we gave next would determine far more than the outcome of this single encounter. It would determine whether the Dominion survived contact with a species we had underestimated for far too long. Rurik did not answer immediately. He stood at his chair, staring at the screen, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. I had never seen him hesitate this long over a decision, and the silence, stretching across the bridge, felt heavier with each passing second. "Captain," I said quietly, stepping closer to him, "we have 2 disabled ships and a hull that cannot penetrate her shields. Continuing this will not change the outcome. It will only change how much worse the outcome becomes." He looked at me, and for a moment I saw something break behind his eyes, the last remnants of Dominion pride finally giving way to simple survival instinct. He turned back to the comm system and pressed the transmission control himself, something he rarely did, preferring to let his officers handle communication while he issued orders. "This is Captain Rurik Thane of the Ashvane Talon," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "We are standing down. Please confirm you will allow safe retreat for our vessels and crew." There was a pause before Captain Bennett responded, and when her voice came through again, some of the coldness from before had softened, replaced by something closer to simple professionalism. "Confirmed," she said. "I have no interest in destroying disabled ships or harming crew members who are no longer a threat. Withdraw your forces, and I will consider this incident resolved." Rurik closed the channel and turned to his crew, giving orders to begin recovery operations for the Corvin Blade and Solon Ward. Emergency shuttles were dispatched to assist with power restoration, and slowly, painfully, our small fleet began preparing to retreat from a confrontation none of us had expected to lose so completely. As the recovery efforts continued, I remained at my station, unable to look away from the human ship still sitting patiently in the dark. Something about its stillness now felt different than before, less threatening, almost watchful, like a guardian ensuring we followed through on our word, rather than a predator waiting to strike. "Vex," Alira said quietly beside me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see the readings during that last exchange, before the shields adapted completely?" I nodded, pulling up the data again on my console. During the brief window before the human ship's defenses had fully calibrated against our weapons, I had captured a partial reading of its internal power distribution. What I saw made my chest tighten, with a fear entirely different from the immediate danger we had just survived. The numbers suggested that what we witnessed represented perhaps a fraction of the ship's actual capacity. Entire sections of its power core remained dormant throughout the engagement, as if the vessel had never needed to draw on its full reserves to handle 2 Dominion warships and their combined firepower. "It barely used any of its actual capability," I said, the realization settling over me like a physical weight. Everything we saw, the disabled frigates, the adaptive shields, the impossible speed, that was restraint. That was a ship holding back. Priam, who had been quietly monitoring his own console since the ceasefire, looked over with an expression I had never seen on him before, all his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by something closer to genuine dread. "If that was restraint," he said slowly, "what does their actual military look like?" Nobody answered him. Nobody could. As our fleet began the slow process of retreat, I kept my sensors trained on the human vessel, partly out of professional duty, partly because I could not bring myself to look away from something that had so thoroughly reshaped my understanding of galactic power. I watched as it remained perfectly still, making no move to pursue us, no attempt to press whatever advantage it clearly held. Then something happened that none of us expected. A second signal appeared on our long-range sensors, approaching from beyond the system's outer boundary. My heart rate spiked as I ran the identification protocols, half expecting another impossible surprise, waiting to compound the disaster we had already survived. "Captain," I said, "we have an additional contact approaching. Large mass, similar hull signature to the Meridian." Rurik's face paled further. "Another one," he said, barely above a whisper. I continued monitoring the new arrival, and as it drew closer, additional details filled in across my display. This new vessel was significantly larger than the Meridian. its hull marked with visible weapon emplacements rather than the smooth, unmarked plating of the survey ship. Where the Meridian had been built for quiet exploration, this new arrival looked purpose-built for confrontation, its every angle radiating a kind of deliberate menace that made my instruments hesitate before finishing their analysis. "Identification complete," I said, my voice tight. "This is not another survey vessel. Weapon signature classification suggests this is a dedicated combat platform." Captain Bennett's voice returned over the comm, and this time there was something almost apologetic in her tone, though the underlying steel remained. "That would be the Halden Ridge," she said. "One of our escort cruisers. I contacted them as a precaution when your fleet first opened fire, in case reinforcements became necessary. It appears they are simply here to confirm the situation is resolved." I stared at the approaching ship, easily twice the size of the Meridian, bristling with weapon systems the survey vessel had never needed to reveal, and I understood with sickening clarity exactly how close we had come to a conflict that would have ended not with 2 disabled ships, but with our entire fleet reduced to drifting wreckage. "They sent reinforcements before we even fired the second volley," Alira murmured beside me, disbelief clear in her voice. "They were prepared for us to escalate before we ourselves decided to escalate." "That is not preparation," I said quietly. "That is simply understanding exactly how a situation like this typically unfolds. They expected our pride to override our judgment, and they were right to expect it." The Halden Ridge slowed as it approached, taking up a position near the Meridian, but making no aggressive movement toward our retreating fleet. Its presence alone, silent and imposing, served as a clearer warning than any words Captain Bennett could have offered. This was not a single unusual ship we had encountered by unfortunate chance. This was a demonstration that vessels like the Meridian, capable of disabling 2 Dominion warships without serious effort, were not unique or exceptional within their fleet structure. They were simply standard. Rurik watched the new arrival with an expression I recognized as something close to genuine terror, an emotion I had never witnessed from him in 11 cycles of service together. He turned to me, his voice quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. "Doran," he said, "compile everything we have gathered today. Every scan, every reading, every exchange. This needs to reach Dominion High Command immediately." "Understood, Captain," I said, already pulling the relevant data together across my console. As I worked, I allowed myself to reflect on everything that had unfolded since those first anomalous readings appeared on my screen. We had approached this encounter with the confidence of a species that had spent generations believing itself untouchable, dismissing humanity as young, primitive, unworthy of serious caution. That confidence had been shattered within the span of a single engagement, not through any deception or ambush, but simply through humanity choosing to reveal exactly how capable they truly were, one careful and restrained demonstration at a time. The Meridian and Halden Ridge remained motionless as our fleet completed its withdrawal, offering no further communication, no further warning, simply allowing us to retreat with whatever remained of our dignity intact. I found myself grateful for that restraint, even as it deepened the unease settling into my chest. A species capable of such overwhelming strength, choosing repeatedly to hold back rather than destroy, felt somehow more unsettling than an enemy who simply attacked without hesitation. As our cruiser finally crossed back into recognized Dominion territory, I sat quietly at my station, staring at the compiled data now ready for transmission to High Command. Every number, every reading, every recorded exchange painted the same terrifying picture. We had encountered what humanity considered an ordinary survey vessel, backed by an escort cruiser sent purely as precaution, and that single encounter had proven more dangerous than any conflict the Dominion had faced in recent memory. I thought about Captain Bennett's calm voice throughout the entire engagement, never rising in anger, never gloating in victory, simply stating facts, and offering warnings with the patience of someone who genuinely hoped we would choose to listen. That patience, more than any weapon we had witnessed, told me everything I needed to understand about the true scale of what humanity had become since we had last bothered to take them seriously. The report I was preparing would reach Dominion Command within hours, and I already knew how difficult it would be for anyone reading it to accept the truth contained within its data. Generations of assumptions about humanity's insignificance would need to be unlearned, and unlearning assumptions that deeply rooted rarely happens without resistance, without denial, without the kind of stubborn pride that had nearly gotten our entire crew destroyed today. As I finalized the last details of my report, I glanced one final time at the sensor feed showing our retreat, at the 2 human vessels remaining perfectly still behind us, watching, patient, utterly confident in a strength they had barely needed to demonstrate. Whatever the Dominion believed about the galaxy's balance of power, that belief had just been proven catastrophically wrong, and I could only hope High Command would listen to reason before pride pushed us toward a conflict none of us could survive. 3 days after our return to Dominion territory, I stood in a briefing chamber far larger and colder than anything aboard the Ashvane Talon, surrounded by officers whose ranks outweighed mine by considerable margin. My report had reached High Command exactly as promised, and now I found myself summoned to explain, in person, exactly what had happened at the edge of our forgotten border. The chamber held perhaps 20 senior officers, all seated around a curved table facing a central display where my compiled data now hung suspended in the air, every scan and reading from the encounter laid bare for scrutiny. At the head of the table sat Fleet Marshal Corvain Ash, a figure whose reputation for demanding absolute certainty before accepting any report had preceded him across every rank I had ever served. "Officer Doran," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had already decided my findings were exaggerated before I even began speaking. "Your report suggests a single unarmed survey vessel disabled 2 Dominion warships without sustaining meaningful damage. I find this difficult to accept at face value." "With respect, Fleet Marshal," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the pressure of every gaze in the room, "the data speaks for itself. I have included full sensor logs, weapon signatures, and communication transcripts. This was not exaggeration. This was restraint from an opponent who chose not to escalate beyond what was necessary." A murmur passed through the assembled officers, some skeptical, others clearly unsettled by the confidence in my voice despite my relatively junior standing. Ash studied me for a long moment before gesturing toward the display. "Walk us through it," he said. "Every detail. Leave nothing out." I did exactly that, recounting the entire encounter from the first anomalous reading to our final retreat, letting the sensor data speak alongside my own account. I described the shields that adapted mid-battle, the weapon that disabled critical systems without causing hull breach, the sudden arrival of a second vessel clearly more capable than the first, sent purely as precaution rather than necessity. Throughout the presentation, the chamber grew progressively quieter, the initial skepticism slowly giving way to something closer to genuine alarm. When I finished, silence held the room for several long seconds before one of the younger officers, seated near the back, spoke up with a question that seemed to summarize everyone's unspoken fear. "If a survey vessel demonstrated this level of capability while holding back," she asked, "what does their actual battle fleet look like?" "I do not know," I admitted honestly, "but based on everything I witnessed, I believe we have spent generations dramatically underestimating a species we dismissed too quickly." Fleet Marshal Ash leaned back in his chair, studying the frozen image of the Meridian still hanging in the display, its smooth, unmarked hull looking almost deceptively simple despite everything it had proven capable of. "The Dominion has expanded across hundreds of systems," he said slowly, measuring threats primarily by territory controlled and fleet size accumulated over centuries. "Humanity controls a fraction of the space we do, with a fleet size that has always appeared modest by comparison." "Perhaps that comparison was always flawed," I said, choosing my words carefully, despite the risk of speaking too boldly in front of superior officers. "We measured them by the metrics that made sense to us, territory and numbers, without ever properly assessing what their technology and strategic philosophy might actually represent." Another officer, older and clearly more experienced in engagements across contested space, spoke up from further down the table. "Their behavior throughout this engagement is what concerns me most," he said. Every response was measured. Every escalation matched precisely to the threat presented. Nothing more, nothing less. That is not the behavior of a species relying on brute strength. That is the behavior of a species with absolute confidence in their capability, one that no longer needs to prove anything through excessive force. I nodded, appreciating that someone else in the room had recognized the pattern I found most unsettling throughout the entire encounter. "Captain Bennett never once raised her voice," I said. "She never gloated, never threatened beyond what was necessary. She simply stated facts, gave warnings, and followed through exactly as promised when those warnings went unheeded. That kind of calm, I believe, comes only from a species that has moved beyond needing to perform strength for an audience. They simply possess it, and they know it, and they no longer feel any need to convince anyone else of that fact." The chamber fell silent again, each officer processing the weight of what this meant for how the Dominion understood its place within the wider galaxy. Fleet Marshal Ash finally broke the silence, his earlier skepticism now replaced by something closer to grim acceptance. "What do you recommend, Officer Doran?" he asked, and the fact that he was asking a junior censor officer for strategic recommendation spoke volumes about how thoroughly this encounter had shaken established assumptions. I took a moment before answering, wanting to choose my words with the same careful precision Captain Bennett had shown throughout our entire confrontation. "I recommend immediate diplomatic outreach," I said, "not from a position of authority, as we have traditionally approached contact with younger species, but from a position of genuine respect. I believe humanity has spent recent years developing capabilities we simply failed to notice, focused as we were on outdated assumptions about their limitations." "And if diplomatic outreach fails," Ash asked, "then I believe the Dominion needs to seriously reconsider whether provoking further contact with humanity's fleet is a risk worth taking," I said honestly. "Based on everything I witnessed, I do not believe we currently possess the capability to win a sustained conflict against them, and I believe continuing to underestimate them will only lead to consequences far worse than 2 disabled frigates." The room remained quiet for a long moment, officers exchanging glances that carried more weight than any words could express. Finally, Fleet Marshal Ash nodded slowly, dismissing the assembly with instructions to begin drafting formal diplomatic protocols for renewed contact with human authorities, this time approached with considerably more caution than our previous interactions had ever required. As the chamber emptied, I remained behind for a moment, staring at the frozen image of the Meridian still displayed above the table, that long, smooth hull that had so thoroughly reshaped everything I thought I understood about galactic power. I thought about Captain Bennett's voice, calm and patient, even in the face of our repeated aggression, and I wondered what kind of society had produced commanders capable of such measured restraint, despite possessing such overwhelming capability. Weeks later, word filtered back through official channels that renewed diplomatic contact with human authorities had indeed been established, this time conducted with a level of caution and respect that our previous approach had entirely lacked. I never learned the full details of those negotiations, my rank keeping me well outside the circles where such matters were properly discussed, but I did hear, through quiet conversation among fellow officers, that Dominion strategists had begun a complete reassessment of every assumption we held about humanity's true capabilities. I often found myself thinking back to that encounter at the edge of our forgotten border, replaying every moment in my mind as though searching for some detail I had missed, some clue that might have prepared us better for what we found there. But the truth, I eventually accepted, was simpler than any hidden detail I might have overlooked. We had approached a young and unfamiliar species with arrogance, born from centuries of unchallenged dominance, assuming that our size and our history guaranteed our superiority, without ever properly testing whether that assumption held true. It had taken a single survey vessel, built for peaceful exploration rather than war, to shatter that assumption completely. Captain Bennett and her crew had shown remarkable patience throughout an encounter where they held every advantage, offering warning after warning, restraint after restraint, hoping we would recognize the wisdom of stepping back, before pride pushed us into a conflict that would have ended in disaster. I often wondered what might have happened if Rurik had listened to my initial hesitation, if we had chosen diplomacy from the very first moment, rather than allowing pride to guide our response. Perhaps we would have avoided the damage to our frigates entirely, avoided the fear that still occasionally crept into my thoughts during quiet moments aboard ship. But perhaps, I eventually decided, the lesson needed to be learned exactly as harshly as it was, in order for it to truly change how the Dominion approached its relationship with a species we had dismissed for far too long. The final entry in my personal log from that encounter remains the same words I wrote the night we returned to Dominion space. Exhausted and shaken by everything we had witnessed, I wrote them not as an official report, but as something closer to a private reminder, a lesson I never wanted to forget, regardless of how many cycles passed afterward. We assumed size, and history determined strength, and we were wrong. We assumed young species remained weak simply because they had not yet accumulated centuries of expansion, and we were wrong about that too. What we witnessed that day was not a monster wearing the shape of a human warship, as some officers later described it in their own reports, driven by fear into exaggeration and disbelief. It was simply a species that had grown far beyond what we ever bothered to notice, quietly developing strength while we remained comfortably certain of our own superiority. I do not know what future encounters between the Dominion and humanity might bring. I do not know whether the diplomatic efforts currently underway will succeed in building genuine understanding between our peoples, or whether pride and fear will eventually push both sides toward conflict neither can truly afford. But I know this much for certain, based on everything I witnessed that day, at the edge of our forgotten border. We were the ones who had grown careless. We were the ones who had allowed centuries of unchallenged strength to breed dangerous assumptions about who deserved caution and who did not. And if the Dominion hopes to survive whatever comes next in our relationship with humanity, we will need to remember, every single day, exactly how thoroughly wrong we were to ever consider them anything less than a species worthy of our deepest respect and our most careful attention. That is the lesson I carry with me still, long after the fear of that encounter has faded into simple memory. And it is a lesson I hope every officer who reads my report will carry with them as well, for the sake of everyone who might one day find themselves facing a human vessel across the quiet dark of unclaimed space, wondering whether what they are looking at could possibly be as dangerous as their instincts are screaming it must be. It can be, and more often than not, it is exactly that dangerous, and exactly that patient, and exactly that willing to give you every chance to walk away before showing you precisely why you should have taken it.